Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thought this would be an opportune moment to update the social contract during the pandemic series. I think we'll call this the People Are in the Streets edition. Now, this, of course, indicates that your social contract is beginning to fray. In the first one, I mentioned that locking down your country and sort of immolating your economy and having people do this voluntarily without lots of enforcement was a part of the social contract. And the deal, the implicit deal, is that while you as an individual are going to carry some burden of not being able to work and being insecure about the future, not knowing what was coming, your governments, state, local, federal, were going to provide you with a safety net and a sense of security and a sense that the future would be okay and things would work out. And that the success of a program, excuse me, depended on how well those two things work together. And of course, what we're now seeing is a pretty abject failure on the part, particularly of the federal, but also of many state governments, to actually address the underlying social conditions that the contract is built on. And so, not surprisingly, what happens is the already existing underlying tensions will then be exacerbated and begin to erupt. And this is kind of what we're seeing now. If, for instance, unfortunately, if every time an unarmed black man were killed by the police in this country, there were riots, we would have nothing but a continuous succession of riots. That is a horrible thing to say, but it is a truth that has to be addressed and faced quite squarely. This is our history. This is our present. So what you have to understand or try and work out is, one of the things, not the only thing, of course, is while this is the proximate cause, yet another instance of police brutality, the tinder that's being lit on fire has been building and building and building. And again, these are the tensions that are exposed when you do something like lock a country down for a pandemic, or if there's a war, or if there's, natural disaster or an incredible economic collapse. All these sorts of changes stress the fundamental agreement of your culture, however flawed, however imperfect it is, and bring to the surface the underlying tensions. So one, certainly not, again, the only thing you can look at here is, and particularly if you're not from the United States, you may not realize that the U.S. social programs are designed so that it looks like the government is going to provide you with benefits, but they're designed such that those benefits cannot be accessed. It really is more or less that simple. For instance, if you want to collect unemployment, generally speaking, you have to be fired. That's just step one. If you quit your job in most states and under most circumstances, you simply can't get unemployment because you have to be fired. And so notice that in itself, so it puts the burden, weirdly, on you as a worker, right? To say, if I'm in a crappy job and I don't like this and I would like to have another opportunity, you have to get fired before the government will help you with that transition. So it's a perverse incentive, but it's designed this way because we do not want to give unemployment benefits or any other kind of benefits to the wrong people. This is always the goal. The lazy people, the people we don't like, the people who are unworthy. And without doubt and without exception, what we mean here is African Americans and the minority community. and that's really the function of our welfare, health, and aid system, is generally to try to avoid providing benefits to those people our society deems we don't like. Generally speaking, we really just don't like minorities as a culture. And I know this sounds crazy and sounds extreme, but in my college that I worked at, I guess this go back about 12 years ago, our local mill, we have one large local employer, that's a mill, still working, by the way, amazingly enough. And they had to furlough or lay off about 150 of the 300 people that worked there, which in our community is a huge number. We're a tiny community. So that was a big blow. But there was a state program that my boss, who was director of our campus, knew about that would pay for them to get free education as part of their unemployment. So they could get unemployment, and getting an education counted for them as if they were looking for a job. So instead of looking for a job, they could spend 2 years with us getting retrained, getting, new skills or advancing further on in college, whatever they wanted to do. And so this was really, one of those programs you look at and go, wow, it just kind of makes me believe a little bit in the safety net that we have in our country. Well, after about 3 weeks, and we had enrolled, I'm not sure, I want to say 50 to 60 to 75, somewhere around, let's just say 50, we'll lowball, but I think it was a little more than that, but let's say 50, which for us, again, small school, that's a significant impact. My boss got a call from the state, and they wanted to know how it is we found out about this program, who told us that it existed. And she said, well, she had done her research and she knew this was part of the state programs for unemployment benefits for these types of workers. And they said they were not going to allow us to enroll any more people because we were using too much money. which is like, well, the program was designed specifically for, these sorts of workers who are getting laid off, and now they can retrain. And isn't that what we want to do? And finally, they negotiated, and they said, if you don't tell anybody else about this program, don't tell any other colleges, don't tell anybody else, we will let you enroll a few more people, but only a few more. If you tell any more people, or if we get a bunch of more applications, we're going to cut off all the funding to the people that already have it. Because it's, and I know this sounds crazy, but really, this is not an outlier. This is sort of the structure of the system. And so, back to the pandemic, how does the pandemic aid flow out? Well, primarily, in a couple of ways. One, of course, lots of money for the Federal Reserve for the banks. And of course, easy to pick on that, but to keep the banking's financial structure together isn't unreasonable, but it does seem unreasonable that they get all the money and they don't have to fill out any paperwork. Then you get direct checks to basically everybody. Everybody gets their $1,200 stimulus check. Now, you say everybody, but it's important to understand how that actually flows out. If you pay your taxes and you pay with electronic deposit, meaning you have access to computers and regular banking and a regular address, and you pay your taxes on a regular basis, you could just get electronic deposit, and your $1,200 check most likely came fairly quickly. Now, the poorer you are, the less likely all those things are to pertain. So if you're moving around a lot because you're poor, you don't have a steady address, maybe you haven't paid taxes for a while because you don't make enough money to pay taxes. Maybe you don't have a regular bank account, so you can't get electronic deposit. So you need to get a check from the government mailed to who knows where based on, you've got an irregular filing habit. Well, now you're either A, not going to get your $1,200 stimulus check, or B, it's going to take a long, long time. And I know people who are on both ends of the spectrum for those very reasons. So the wealthier you are, better educated, better established you are, then the easier it was to get that one-time payment. Notice, no security for the future there, just one-time payment. You probably got it in fairly good order and fairly quickly. Not everybody, of course, but that was, and then the further you went down the social ladder and the economic ladder, the more likely it was to be delayed or to never arrive. And of course, the minority community is poor at a very disproportionate rate, particularly the African-American community. So it's one way of looking at it is to say it was a way of not sending stimulus checks to a large proportion of the African-American community in this country. Functionally, that's how it worked. Now we come to the federal unemployment insurance. Now, again, for people in Europe who may not realize this, we don't really have federal unemployment. Unemployment is a state program, and all 50 states have 50 different programs because that's how we do it. And so what you're doing is you're going to your state to apply for unemployment. And then the federal government was supplementing that regular state unemployment with an extra around, depending, say $600. So while this was actually being drawn up, and this suggestion did make it through the first stimulus bill, people already were complaining that this is a disincentive to work, that people were going to get too much money and then they weren't going to want to work. So again, that it goes way back. This is the code word for those lazy people who are just a drain on the system, are going to take money and then they're just going to do nothing because that's so much easier to work. Now, this at a time when you have 36 million unemployed who have been told that it is illegal for them to go to work. I mean, that's how deep seated, unbelievably, like in the sort of core of our outlook, that the whole, generally Republicans, but the general cultural outlook, there was a fair bit of this, like, oh, well, you can't give people money for not working because then they'll be lazy and they won't want to go back to work when they're supposed to. So the unemployment will run out in, I think it's July, the unemployment runs out. So again, no security for the future. And now you're at your unemployment office in your state. Well, many states, one might even say most states, are designed so that you can't get unemployment. Again, back to the example I used earlier. You're not supposed to apply for unemployment. If you do, we're going to make it as hard as possible for you to get it. Florida is sort of the extreme example of this. Their entire system was designed so you could not, look it up. I know it sounds like I'm making this up, but their system was designed so that no one could apply for unemployment because A, they didn't want to pay for it, and B, then they could say there weren't unemployed people because there weren't people getting unemployment. Now, if you look at the statistics for who's gotten laid off, the shutdown of the pandemic has dramatically it affected the poorer classes, the poorer working classes, at just an astronomically higher rate. So much so that average wages in the country skyrocketed. They jumped a very large percentage. Why? Because medium and high earners got laid off at such a lower rate, and that low wage earners got laid off so incredibly consistently that of those people who were left working, they were making on average a hell of a lot more because all the people who were working for minimum wage and low wages just got laid off. So you lay off a bunch of people who are already, sort of marginal, not making that much. And you say, all right, we're going to provide you a benefit that you probably can't access, or if you can access it, it's going to be really hard to get to. And these systems, which were already underfunded and poorly designed, and again, made for you not to be able to get the benefit because they didn't want you to, because it's expensive and, you're lazy. That's why you don't have a job and you're the wrong person. Let's face it. Then got, whatever, millions of applications in one day and the next day and the next day. So the systems all over the country just collapse, massive fraud, all kinds of every possible problem. So the quote unquote safety net just blew up, was not capable of handling this. So now, and again, this problems fell massively, disproportionately on the lower working classes, on the people who made the least money, were the most likely to be laid off and the most likely to have difficulty accessing A, the unemployment insurance they would need to survive, and B, to get the one-time stimulus check that would be very much easier for someone who's making more money to get. So bizarrely, people who were still working got a $1,200 check at a disproportionate rate to people who were laid off, who also had a hard time, if ever, to access federal unemployment benefits, which were already being talked about as a bad idea because it's making those people lazy. So, wow, I know that seems like a long, convoluted way, but it is important to understand that this fundamentally disproportionate response is not a mistake. This is not some sort of oversight. It's not some like, oh, this is actually the structure of our government system. You want to help the right people, and the right people are not African Americans and other minorities. Those are definitively the wrong people. This is, everybody talks about Rosa Parks' brave stand on the bus, one of the big kickoff events of the civil rights movement. One of the things it did in the country is destroy public transportation, because governments, cities, local municipalities, state governments, federal government no longer wanted to invest in public transportation because it was going to be integrated and it was going to be the wrong people were getting the benefits. That, I mean, it sounds crazy, but this is one of the big challenges, right? If you don't want this. The LA subway system, originally as designed, did not have subway stops in African American communities. So it would go through them, but it just, and then they said, oh, well, that was a design oversight. And eventually they had to put them in, but yeah, whoops, that was a big mistake there, right? So these kinds of moments occur again and again and again. So this is not some sort of, unique situation that, oh, all of a sudden the pandemic has caused. What's happened, and this is back to the social contract thing, any stressor, big stressor like a pandemic, emphasizes the underlying problems that your social contract is already struggling with, those basic tensions. And this is just particularly well focused because it requires, ethically, one would think that if you lay off 36 million people, that you provide them with some sort of confidence that their future will be provided for. And that, two, that the future is going to come. And instead, what they've been told is, one, you're lazy. Two, your benefits are virtually or very difficult to access rather than being very simple to access. And three, there's no security about them. Like, and they're actually set to run out, as if all this is going to magically go away in about 3 weeks and everything will be fine, and 36 million people will be back at work. Yeah, this seems unlikely. I'm just going to say very unlikely. So those sorts of stressors enter into the pre-existing structure that is unbelievably racist at its very core structure and design. So again, not a mistake. Another way you can look at this is the wealthier you are, basically, in most of the country, the more likely you are to own a home. So a big part of the bailout package was mortgage relief. You could apply, millions of Americans have, you could apply to not have to pay your mortgage for 6 or 12 months. I think 6 months or 12, I'm not sure. Anyway, for 6 months, and I think then you can get an extension to 12 months. So that's great if you own a home. I mean, I think it was a necessary and good aspect of the package that would bail out, just as I think the unemployment was a good idea and the stimulus checks were a good idea. It's just the structure didn't allow them to work very well. For people who pay rent, well, too bad for you, right? So it's not like the people who are paying rent have an easier time paying than the people who have houses, right? This is in fact, again, disproportionately, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to rent. Of course, it's not a universal thing. It's just, an average. And the more likely the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be a minority. And so we passed a system that benefits predominantly middle and upper middle class people, predominantly white people, and one that did not help the people who are predominantly poor and predominantly minority. Again, this doesn't seem like a mistake. It doesn't seem like they went, this is, we've sort of missed these people. Let's do something about it. No, this was clearly, again, just an expression of our ongoing view of social welfare as going to the wrong people, hence something you don't want to do. You don't want to pay it as a government, as a culture, as a society. And that when the government does decide they need to spend money and they do decide they need to invest money or do, in a pandemic or other financial collapse, if you look on the first list, who it's easy to get money to and who doesn't seem to bother anybody is banks, financial institutions, and then the upper middle class and then the middle class, right? And then once you get a little lower than that, it's like, ooh, all of a sudden, we don't have the money for that. And so, these sorts of deep-seated cultural biases that go all the way back, this sort of ingrained racism that's built into the very infrastructure of the systems that are needed to deliver on the social contract in a time of pandemic, are failing, right? And how do you know they're failing? Well, there you go, right? This is pretty obvious how we know they're failing at the moment. So this is one of the things when you think about the contract and in this case, in a moment where the contract is fraying, is that people in the earlier videos, and some people have commented and said, hey, look, there's all these imperfections and exploitations. And yes, absolutely. It's not that the social contract is perfect or even good. It's not even that it's ideal, certainly. It's just that there's a rough social agreement filled with tensions and problems and all kinds of difficulties, but that generally most of the people most of the time go along with. And by the way, again, the evidence clearly points this out. People started locking them down because they can track people by their phone usage. So they kind of have a rough estimate of how much people have been moving around. And it turns out that when medical officials and stuff started talking about the need to lock down, people did that voluntarily before governors and city council members and mayors started stepping in saying, oh, you have to do this. And pretty much people have been self-liberating, right? They've been moving around more rapidly than government officials have been saying, oh, it's okay to move around, which again is another, slight tension. But what it shows is the voluntary nature of this, that this is governments really don't have the authority to enforce that much. Churchill, I think was it Churchill or, no, I think it was Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. I think everything Churchill said so much, I always think he says everything, but I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who said the key to leadership is to find a parade and run and get in front of it, right? And that's, because it suggests that if people are already going, that's what you want to do. And there's, I think, a great deal of truth in that, is that the contract depends on almost everybody going along almost all the time. But there doesn't mean there aren't tensions and all kinds of problems with it. Now we're seeing what happens when those problems and tensions boil over, when ongoing systematic structural issues hit an event, the just pointless murder of an African-American man, by the way, by state officials. It's important to make this distinction. These people are paid with tax dollars, right? So they say, oh, there's these murders and there's murders in the black community. It's like, yeah, but those people, we don't pay them, right? That's a totally different thing. When state employees, city employees, government officials murder people, in public, that, you see, there's a problem, right? There's really, really a problem of a whole different ethical scale, right? So that kind of core fire hits that very dry tinder. And there's a lot of it because of all these structural issues that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so when you look around, this is why, Russia got very excited at the kickoff of the pandemic. So here's an opportunity, right? They were very cagey about saying, oh, this is going to create tensions. We want to try and exploit that. This is, this is what countries do. What if you're trying to undermine or help an ally, you look for these sorts of opportunities. Or an enemy, of course, in this case. So these sorts of cultural frictions exist, and now the dry if gets sparked. Now, the question is, will the system respond? This is always the question. If the system is dynamic enough, which I think ours is, and responsive enough, which I think it is, it can address this. It doesn't mean it will. Right? I don't predict the future. Who knows? But will the system be able to, the governors, the mayors, federal government, and various aspects and ways, look at this and go, oh, here's a problem that needs redressing? Or will they look at it and go, let's fan the chaos, right? Which is possible, which would be very bad, but it is possible. But generally speaking, I think it's much more likely that there will be all kinds of levels of responses, very complex things. But at some point, it is an opportunity and a call to try and not just address the immediate cause, one person being killed by state employees in public, but the underlying structural tensions of racism that are just writ through the society and the government at every level that have created this dynamic situation, which then the pandemic hits and exposes. Right. Again, it's a matter of exposure, of increased tension on weaknesses. So the downside is, wow, really big weakness. The upside is, and generally I'm an incredibly optimistic person, is the response across the country has been dynamic and loud, and lots of people participating from all over the place, saying, you know what, for some reason, now we're saying enough is enough. It may be like the Women's March of 2016, which I believe was the largest civil march of all time. in the United States. I think that's right. It was millions of women, not just women's, but women and supporters of women, right? March, and a massive march. And you could immediately see the results of this in elected officials, women running for office, women being elected to office, young women in particular, at every level of government all across the country. And we're still seeing it. We're still seeing the waves feeding off of that. This may be a similar event where, this is a spark that doesn't just breed short-term chaos, but actually breeds a beginning. Well, it's only going to be a beginning of change. And the pandemic then, while being bad in many ways, may have actually served a valuable function of getting us to address or begin to address some of the underlying tensions that now have been exposed so starkly and in so many different ways and to so many people. Because his last note on this, because one thing the pandemic did, when you put 30 plus a million of people in the United States, I know lots of other people in the other places in the world, but in the United States, you put 30 million people unemployed, 30 plus million people unemployed, who all of a sudden are thrown back on a system, many of whom probably had never encountered it in this direct way before, right? They really hadn't needed to access it. It's been there, but they hadn't had to worry about it. Their friends and family. Well, now so many people so quickly, it's like, oh, hey, I've got to make this work. And all of a sudden you find out that, hey, this damn system it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work fast. Asking me lots of questions I don't understand why I should need to answer, creating all kinds of barriers and problems, not getting the help I need, not getting my student loans forgiven. All of a sudden it creates a sense of community, a sense of shared grievance, a sense of shared problem. And so all of a sudden a dividing line that, you might have thought, oh, well, those are the wrong kind of people anyway, I'm not like them. All of a sudden you find out, ooh, maybe you are a little more like them than you thought you might be, because now you're on the other receiving end. Now you find yourself in the position of lots of poor whites and lots of minorities who are going, wow, this system just doesn't work very well, certainly not under the current circumstances. And so it might be that creates enough of a sense of affinity and enough of a sense of shared identity that rather than creating a divide, exacerbating a divide, it might be the beginning of a capacity for people to feel a greater deal of empathy and begin to work towards these issues. And finally, I'll go back to James Baldwin, because James Baldwin, if you're curious about these kinds of issues, in fact, if you're curious about anything, James Baldwin, right? He's the man. He's just one of the great American thinkers. He points out that, look, this is not a problem. African Americans have this problem, but it's not their problem. This is created by white America, right? This is the problem of white America. And at some point, white Americans have to face themselves to address it. And so again, this pandemic might actually give us that opportunity, which would be amazing. I mean, it would be one of the, galvanizing moments basically in certainly American history, if we could begin this process in a serious way, looking at it structurally, governmentally, socially, and seeing that all these fissures and dividing lines and all this that exist in our society that are being exposed by the pandemic can be addressed, that we can deal with this, that it is doable. In some ways it doesn't seems immense, but it does also seem just so doable by empathy and insight. But so this is what the social contracts are about, and this is what any stress on a social contract is about, is the some force from the outside, or maybe even from the inside, but often from the outside, challenges your society. And then if the social contract holds and grows and changes and is dynamic enough to address that challenge, well, then you move on. If not, well, that's when you get sort of those massive revolutionary changes in history. So social contract during the pandemic, I think the People in the Street edition. Thank you.